morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Our topic today is the natural law. So I want to start with a little bit of material. First of all, the letter to the Romans. If any of you have ever read this epistle straight through, you know that it opens on kind of a sour note, actually. St. Paul's letters always open with a very extended greeting, and then typically he goes into a blessing. This was, I think, common for what's called the epistolary literature of the ancient world. And then he goes into talking about the heading. This is not St. Paul, but this is the heading in the New American Bible. Humanity without Christ. So what he's trying to do in the letter to the Romans is talk about what we call justification now, the grace of justification, the whole process by which the redemption that was won for us by Christ is applied to us. So the reason why I'm starting here is because St. Paul actually talks about the natural law, what we now call the natural law. So I'm going to read this to you, okay? Hang on to your hats, okay, because this is kind of gloomy, the way St. Paul presents it. This is chapter 1, beginning at verse 18, and I'm going to read through to 23. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against the irreligious and perverse spirit of men, who in this perversity of theirs hinder the truth. In fact, whatever can be known about God is clear to them. He himself made it so. Since the creation of the world, invisible realities, God's eternal power and divinity have become visible, recognized through the things he has made. Therefore, these men are inexcusable. They certainly had knowledge of God, yet they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks. They stultified themselves through speculating to no purpose, and their senseless hearts were darkened. They claimed to be wise, but turned into fools instead. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images representing mortal men, birds, beasts, and snakes. Now that's the main part of it. I don't want to read the rest of it actually because it gets even more dire than this, as St. Paul is describing this to him. But basically, as far as St. Paul is concerned, the wrath of God is not that he's standing there like Jupiter holding a thunderbolt waiting to hurl it at us. The wrath of God is that when people turn away from him, he lets them. And when they turn away from him, when they turn away from the truth, when they turn away from the law, the moral law, that's my language, not St. Paul's, the moral law, what they are choosing is incoherence. And what he describes from verses 24 through 32 is the kind of morality or lack of morality that results from turning away from God and his moral law. So that's the beginning. What I want to say about this is that since the Second Vatican, or the First Vatican Council, 1870, the very first Vatican Council, the Catholic Church has held as a matter of faith, so this is defined doctrine, that it is possible to know God without the light of revelation. So this is what we call natural theology. So it is possible to do that. And I think this follows from what St. Paul is saying here. The church doesn't endorse any particular natural theology, but it believes that it is possible to know God and therefore to know his law with what the council called the light of unaided reason. The light of unaided reason. The aid to reason being divine revelation. So, without divine revelation, it is possible to know God. So, and St. Paul's language is, it's very much admonitory. So what he's saying is it's possible to know God from his effects in the world. And these men, he's not specifying who he's talking about, but he's talking about his compatriots in the Greco-Roman Empire, Mediterranean, the beginning of or in the middle of the first century. They know better is what he's saying. So they know the natural law, and they turn away from it. Now, one of the things we have to remember about the ancient Roman world, for instance, we learned a lot about this when the excavations in Pompeii started, which I think were as early as the 17th century. You remember, Pompeii was buried almost intact by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And I'm trying to remember the date for that. And I can't remember. It's roughly around this time, though. So it caught the ancient Roman world completely by surprise. The Latin language did not have a word for volcano. And by our standards today, what we recognize is that this eruption was a pyroclastic flow. So they never had a chance. Pyroclastic flows can go as fast as 70 miles an hour. And what they found subsequently, I visited the museum there in Naples that actually has some of these casts that they made. But the pyroclastic flow overtook people who were in the course of running. Okay? And what happened was, as they were excavating Pompeii, they would find these hollow spots, and they weren't really sure what they were until somebody realized these were the impressions of bodies that had been caught in the pyroclastic flow. So they've made plaster casts of the body, and it really is very touching to see them. Well, what I'm getting at, I'm getting aside already here. What I'm getting at is Pompeii was buried almost intact, so that when the excavations started there, and they're still going on, by the way, they're still going on, a lot of the life of the Roman Empire came to light. And one of the things that came to light that shocked and titillated, the world of the 17th, the 18th century, was the everyday pornography that Romans lived with. And it was three-dimensional pornography, so there were a lot of statues. If you go to Pompeii, you have to pay to do this, but you can go on a tour that they call the Forbidden Pompeii, and you can see this. I didn't myself. But, that's what St. Paul is talking about. That's what St. Paul is talking about. The everyday pornography, the everyday immorality that the Romans of that empire period lived with. And he saw this, the immorality, okay? It's the immorality itself that he saw as the wrath of God. So God abandoned them to this. And the reason why I'm dwelling on this is because it's one of the explanations for the phenomenal spread of Christianity in the first century. The Roman Empire was tired. It was morally spent at that point. It was without hope. And Christianity, it was an offshoot of Judaism, so it would have been known as such initially. And Judaism was known in the ancient world, both for its monotheism and for the demanding quality of its ethics. Christianity would have been known then as a sect of Judaism. And it was a very powerful and evangelical, a very energized sect of Judaism. So it was about spreading the word. And the primary thing that it brought to the ancient world was hope. So I'm thinking, even as I say this, and maybe it's coming to mind for you also, but if you think of the words of that great Christmas hymn, O Holy Night, it really does describe the situation. So long lay the world in sin and error pining. So the world at that point was helpless. It was prostrate. And Christianity came with this message. So, St. Paul talks about the natural law, this is our term, not his, to set the stage for the coming of Christ. And he spoke then of Christ as fulfilling the dynamism here. That Christ is the one who revealed the truth. And there are a couple of ways that we can look at this, and that we continue to look at it today. The truths of the natural law, the church believes, are accessible to anyone. They're accessible and they are unavoidable. They're accessible to unaided reason. I would add to that, the language I prefer to use actually is an unbiased mind. They are accessible to an unbiased mind. So when we Catholics, for instance, look at a moral truth like thou shalt not kill, we have two sources for our certainty about this truth. One is the natural law, and the other is divine revelation. So in terms of the natural law, we recognize the truth of the commandment against killing. Human society would not have gotten very far if we all had the legal right to kill anyone we got angry with. That's kind of a natural law truth. But we also have another source of certainty, which is God telling us, all life comes from me and belongs to me, and you have no business taking it. So, keep that in mind. When we Catholics talk about the truths of natural law, we believe that they are accessible to an unbiased mind, but we believe that they have also been revealed to us by God. Now, I want to take a step back and actually go to the text of the Catechism here. So as you may recall, the Catechism starts by talking about a natural desire that every human being has for God. Okay, that's a blanket statement. It applies to communists, it applies to socialists, it applies to liberals, it applies to atheists, it applies to agnostics, whether they believe it or not. We're talking about a fundamental human truth here. So it's there. One of the things the Catechism does that I think we need to do from time to time is try to look at reality from God's point of view, as nearly as we can approximate that. We're not gods. We don't think like Him. He's reminded us about that. But from God's point of view, He created us to have a relationship with Him. And it makes perfect sense that if that is what He did and why He did it, He should have placed something in us that's at least in harmony with His plan. And that's what this desire to see Him is about. Most of us experience it primarily as a desire for happiness. But the ultimate happiness, and the only happiness that really counts, is to be found in our relationship with God. So that's the natural desire to see God. The reason why I'm talking about this is because the Catechism then goes on to talk about the things that can interfere with our recognizing this natural desire. So if you go to paragraph 29 in the Catechism, I'm just going to read this paragraph to you. But this intimate and vital bond of man to God can be forgotten, overlooked, or even explicitly rejected by man. Okay, we see that. We see the evidence of that all around us. Such attitudes can have different causes. Revolt against evil in the world, religious ignorance or indifference, the cares and riches of this world, the scandal of bad example on the part of believers, currents of thought hostile to religion. Finally, that attitude of sinful man which makes him hide from God out of fear and flee his call. Now this is what the Catechism is saying about the natural desire to see God. What I want to say is these same causes can lead society to ignore or overlook or reject the natural law and the whole natural law approach to morality. So the Catechism following Vatican II talks about the possibility of coming to know God. St. Paul's already talked about this. We can know God from his effects. And the Catechism goes into that in greater detail. This would be paragraphs 31 through 35, excuse me. And let me just read you the summary statement. The Catechism believes that there are two ways of coming to know God from creation itself. One is from the world, and the other is from the human person. So anyone who's ever admired the beauty of a sunset, or the beauty of the mountains, or the beauty of the ocean, and finds himself or herself praying at that point, understands the argument from the world. The order of the world requires a greater mind that created that order. And in a similar way, when you look at the complexity of the human person, and especially when you look at our moral sense, not just our intellect, which is a wonderful enough thing, but the sense of morality that is built into us, our conscience. It seems to require the existence of a supreme moral agent that could bring such creatures into being. So those are, in general, those are the arguments for natural theology. The summary argument, this is what the Catechism says about it. This is paragraph 34. Summary argument is this: the world and man attest that they contain within themselves neither their first principle nor their final end, but rather that they participate in being itself, being with a capital B. They participate in being itself, which alone is without origin or end. So being itself. Sometimes philosophers and theologians refer to being itself as subsistent being. Being which comes from no one else. Perfect being. And that, of course, is God and only God. So, this is natural theology. This you can get a whole degree, okay? There are whole degree programs that are dedicated to natural theology. But that's a 5-minute summary for you. The Catechism, like St. Paul, uses natural theology and natural law to set the stage for talking about how much more perfect the gift we have in Christ actually is. But even for those who do not know that perfection, the natural law still applies. So the natural law in the Catechism is treated very briefly back in this section, Part 3, Life in Christ, Part 3 of the Catechism. And it's sections 1954 to 1960. I just think that's really poetic. 1954 to 1960 is probably the time when Western society was actually turning away from natural law. So the Catechism, again, talking about this from the point of view of God, says, man participates in the wisdom and goodness of the Creator, who gives him mastery over his acts and the ability to govern himself with a view to the true and the good. This is part of our endowment by creation, by being a part of creation. So, and then this is probably as close as the Catechism comes to defining the natural law. The natural law expresses the original moral sense which enables man to discern by reason the good and the evil, the truth and the lie. So it's the original moral sense which enables man to discern by reason the good and the evil, the truth and the lie. So as this section unfolds, the Catechism explains that the natural law gives us the first and essential precepts which govern moral life. These precepts in the natural law hinge on the natural desire to see God, which is the starting point for the Catechism. So, and these precepts are expressed in the Decalogue. This law is called natural because the reason which decrees it properly belongs to our human nature. And there's an implicit contrast when we talk about the natural law. There's an implicit contrast between the realm of nature and then the realm of the supernatural, the realm of grace. I shouldn't say contrast, a distinction. A distinction. So then the Catechism goes on, 1956. The natural law is present in the heart of each man and established by reason. Therefore, it is universal in its precepts, and its authority extends to all men, to every human being. It establishes the dignity of the person and determines the basis for fundamental rights and duties. Its application varies greatly. So to use one example, one feature of natural law is the need for government. And when you look at, you just look at the variety of arrangements across global society, the variety of arrangements for governments, you can see that there is a variety in the way the natural law is applied. Nevertheless, in the diversity of cultures, the natural law remains as a rule that binds men among themselves and imposes on them, beyond the inevitable differences, common principles. So, murder is immoral in every human society. I take murder because that's the least controversial example. So, it is universal in its application. That's one thing that we say about the natural law. The second thing that we say about it, 1958, is that it is immutable. It is unchanging. So, murder is just as immoral in 2011 as it was in the time of Christ, as it was in the time of Moses. So, and then the Catechism says this. It's a remarkable statement. Even when it is rejected in its very principles, it cannot be destroyed or removed from the heart of man. It always rises again. So, everyone in this room has lived through probably one of the most dramatic historical vindications of the natural law in history, and that is the collapse of European communism. So that the collapse of European communism vindicates what the Catechism says here in paragraph 1958. It was an unnatural system of governance. And because of that, its failure was inevitable. Just as the failure of any other tyranny which denies human rights is inevitable. So the law is immutable, and it is applied, or it is universally valid. So 1959 talks about the natural law then as the solid foundation on which man can build the structure of moral rules. It is the indispensable moral foundation for building the human community, and therefore it is the necessary basis for civil law. So those are the things that the Catechism says about the natural law. It's 2 pages altogether in the Catechism. What's ironic to me, it's just an irony of the outline, the way that the Catechism is set up. What's ironic to me is this is chapter 3 in this section of the Catechism. This is chapter 3. But the previous chapters have been talking about features of the natural law. So they talk about, let me go back here. Talk about the virtues. They talk about human dignity. They talk about the person and society. They talk about human solidarity. And the Catechism talks about these things eloquently. I've said this before. I think the Catechism is a remarkable achievement in church history. That it emerged at the time that it did. And that we were providentially blessed to have men like Pope John Paul II, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Christoph Schönberg, to be working on a project like this. So all of those, the virtues, the structure of the moral life, the structure of the human community, human dignity, these are all ordinances, if you will, of the natural law. And again, what we're saying is that they are accessible to human reason. And where they seem unavailable or inaccessible, what we need to look for is the presence of bias. And again, let me go through that list. This is 29, paragraph 29. The revolt against evil in the world. Some people are scandalized at God, for instance, when tragedy befalls the innocent, and especially when it befalls children. There's some people that, especially close friends or family members, that will never forgive God for the death of a child. Now, I think the feelings are understandable there, and when this comes to my attention, that's always the starting point for me, is to express some kind of sympathy or condolence with the tragic sense of loss. But the death of the innocent, the tragic death of the innocent, is not really an argument against God's goodness. And it's not an argument against the wisdom of the moral order. Religious ignorance or indifference. People just don't know. It's amazing to me to read some of the things that people, even educated people, say about Catholicism, because they are so unknowing. And especially the more educated the person is, the more inexcusable that is. Indifference, religious indifference, the idea that one religion is as good as another. It's becoming more and more common. But in the end, the main reason why I could never assent to the truth of that is Jesus. That's all. Jesus is not an argument. He's a person. And just as in a sense he grasped a hold of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, I have to say he's done the same thing for me. And I imagine most of you could say the same thing. Okay? It's not a moral argument. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Period. I don't know why in his providence he's not making that clearer to more people. Okay, but I can tell you this, he's never asked me for advice about what to do about it. So I don't know if he regards it as a problem even. But that's the biggest argument against religious indifference for me is Jesus and the way that he grasps people. The cares and riches of this world. Riches, as we know, the New Testament was very ambivalent in its attitude towards riches, mostly admonitory. Wealth can become a religion in its own right. It's very easy to construct it into a false god. It can become the subject of, to use Paul Tillich's phrase, our ultimate concern. And once it becomes our ultimate concern, we have a false god. Cares can do that too. Sometimes we can be so worried about things in life that the worry crowds out everything else in our consciousness. Scandal, a bad example on the part of believers. Nothing more to say about that. It's perfectly clear. And partly what we're talking about is believers who don't believe, who don't practice what they preach. Sometimes who flagrantly act in contradiction to their proclaimed values. Currents of thought hostile to religion. I'm going to talk about a couple of those in a minute, so let's come back to that. And finally, that attitude of sinful man, which makes him hide from God out of fear and flee his call. That's probably the basic one. Most people who reject the natural law reject something that it stands for. Typically, the importance of the family, as the church understands it. So the union, the lifelong, publicly committed union of a man and a woman in a relationship that is loving and open to life. It's amazing to me how controversial something that simple has become. So, how are we doing on time?
About 10 to 10.
All right. I want to talk about, one of the ways to talk about anything is to talk about its opposite. So I want to talk about these currents of thought that are hostile to the natural law. The first of these, it's a current of thought that's called utilitarianism. Have you heard this term before? Utilitarianism. Sometimes it's called pragmatism, but I think utilitarianism is the more common term. So I'm going to give you a definition of this. that comes from our Sunday Visitors Encyclopedia of Catholic Doctrine. I find this a very useful source, by the way. Don't know if it's still in print, but it was put together by Russell Shaw. I like conciseness in encyclopedias and definitions. So, for instance, a dictionary of theology written by a German will not be concise. So you're much better to get an American or a Frenchman. The best one is Bouillet's Dictionary of Theology, I think. He gets right to the point. So it's not a signed article, so I'm not sure who wrote this. But this is the definition of utilitarianism. The basic moral criterion, according to utilitarianism, is select the action that will produce the best or least bad consequences in the long run for people in general. So the action that will produce the best or least bad consequences in the long run for people in general. So notice it's focused on consequences. For utilitarianism, there is no such thing as an intrinsic right or wrong. So you can see there automatically the point of conflict with our understanding of the natural law. So a shorthand summary of utilitarianism, you've probably heard this many, many times, is the end justifies the means. There are no intrinsic evils. Utilitarianism is very, very widespread in educated Western society. And this is where actually its real power and perniciousness comes in. It's very widespread in our judiciary. I hate to say it, even as towering a Catholic figure as Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court is more utilitarian, I think, than natural law. So there is another current of thought, and by the way, I'm only talking about the currents of thought that we will probably deal with ourselves, that we will have to. There's the whole phenomenon of communism, which is still around, in some forms, but I'm not going into that. Mostly you will not have to argue with communists.
Socialists?
Socialism, actually, I would see as in the form that I'm familiar with, the attenuated form that we deal with here in the United States, it's more utilitarian, I think, than anything else. But the other current of thought we need to be aware of, it calls itself Post-Modernism. Post-Modernism. So I'm going to hope that these markers have ink in them, and I'm going to put a little diagram on the whiteboard here. The natural law tradition is an ancient tradition. It began outside of Judaism and Christianity. So it began, for instance, the figures that we associate with it would be Aristotle, so the Greek, the Academy in Athens. This is the 4th century before Christ, Aristotle. And then a Roman, a very famous Roman who existed, he lived around the time Julius Caesar was becoming an issue in Rome. So his name is Cicero. Cicero, C-I-C-E-R-O. these are two pagan thinkers that really formulated the theory. And Christian thinkers saw how amenable that theory was to Christian moral reflection. And so we incorporated that whole theory of natural law into our own thinking. But remember that the theory itself, the formulation of the theory, began outside of Christianity. So you have the natural law tradition. And I'm just going to draw that as a baseline here. This is natural law. I don't know if you're going to be able to read that. Natural law, I think, was rejected in many respects by the Reformation. So many of the Protestant reformers thought human reason so depraved because of the fall that it was incapable of natural theology or natural law reflection. But in any event, what really rejected the natural law was the Enlightenment. And especially when you look at features of the Enlightenment like the French Revolution. So I shouldn't say simply that it rejected the natural law, because many features of the natural law reappeared in Enlightenment societies. But that, I just want to describe that as kind of an offshoot. So you have the Enlightenment. And then you have this new development which calls itself Post-Modernism. Post-Modernism. So they are after the modern period. And they identify the modern period as the period that started with the Enlightenment. So what we're dealing with in contemporary society are at least these three currents. So let me say a little bit more about postmodernism. Postmodernism rejects the whole construct of reason. So it sees these things that we see as ultimates, they see them as being social constructs. Social constructs. And typically, social constructs that favor the powerful. So they see this whole question of natural law and a natural law order as something that was devised by people that want to use it to maintain their power. So it rejects, for instance, the whole formulation of natural law and the order of the family, for instance, and the family as the basis of society. It rejects these. It rejects these. Postmodernism is very prominent in radical forms of feminism and in an offshoot of radical feminism, and that would be the gay rights movement. So if reason and the whole question, the whole order of natural law is a social construct that creates victims, the only way the victims can liberate themselves is to throw off that whole order. And that's what we see in the radical propositions that have emanated from radical feminism and the gay rights movement. I focus on those two because those are probably the most prominent. They're the ones that have had the greatest impact on our society. So if, a simple summary of utilitarianism is the end justifies the means, my summary of postmodernism is might makes right. We're right back to the sword and the stone. Might makes right. So I've had to deal with feminists, for instance, that were not going to deal with any arguments whatsoever until their agenda was established. So those are two currents of thought. There are two more that I want to talk about. How we do it on time. All right. The next current of thought, I don't think is really conscious thought. And I'm going to take complete responsibility for identifying this, okay? I don't know how many people would actually agree with me. But I think the author's name is Frank Herbert. He's a science fiction writer who came up with the planet Dune. Dune, D-U-N-E. Did any of you ever see that movie or read any of those books? I saw the movie and I read the first book in the series. But in Dune, on this planet Dune, this is kind of an intergalactic federation of some sort, and this planet was crucial to this intergalactic federation because of a substance that was mined there that was called spice. That's all they called it, was spice. And it must have had incredible effects on people because it was very popular, very expensive. But one of the things that the author said about the planet itself is that everyone on the planet was addicted to spice. Everyone was addicted to spice. And that just caused me to think it was idle, distracted thinking, but what would it be like? How would you know, for instance, if you were living on that planet that you were addicted? If everyone around you was addicted, how would you know? So, I tried to think of examples, and one example that came to mind for us, was sugar. On the planet Earth, is everyone addicted to sugar? At least those that can afford it certainly seem to like it a lot. And I've heard people allege that sugar can be an addiction. I don't know what I think about that. I still put sugar in my coffee. But that introduced me to the thought of what an addictive society is, or what it might be like. And what I want to apply this to is, I think the addiction on our planet is to sex. So, and what I want to say about that very simply is, I'm not opposed to sex. That's not what my celibacy is about. But I don't think we do very clear thinking when that subject comes up. And that's one of the reasons why the family is suffering the way that it is. If everyone on the planet is addicted to spice, how would you know it? And if you're in the middle of an addictive society, how would you know that? So one of the things that I want to say about the natural law and natural law morality is that it requires a certain amount of freedom. It requires and it bestows a certain amount of freedom. And if we're dealing with a weak society, even in a society as militarily and economically powerful as the United States is, if we're dealing with a psychologically weak society, you're not going to have that kind of freedom. So, I think that the addictive society is contributing to the denigration of natural law morality. That's the end of this is a whole little digression here. And finally, the last thing that I think is opposed to natural law is sentimentality. Sentimentality. And all I would say about sentimentality is it's the exaltation of emotion over thought. It's very prominent in our society. When you look, for instance, at the increasing acceptability of gay marriage in our society, I think it is a combination of postmodern disdain for natural law reflection as well as sentimentality. The question of gay marriage was inevitable. It was inevitable that we were going to have to deal with that as soon as contraception became acceptable on a widespread scale. As soon as it became morally possible and morally acceptable to completely divorce sex and procreation, the question of gay marriage was inevitable. So if they're divorced, which they are now, why not? Or why deny anybody the right to this recreation that we call sex? So sentimentality trumps a lot of things. Don't want to go on real long about this, but usually when sentimentality is in the argument, anybody that tries to be reasonable will be denounced for, trying to impose morality. They'll be denounced for being unfeeling, for being cold, manipulative maybe, Teutonic. It's one of the ways sentimentality betrays itself. So let me conclude here. On the basis of what St. Paul said, we can have a certainty that those who deny natural law know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. One of the reasons why they are so ferocious in their response to any attempt to reassert the natural law is because they have a bad conscience about what they're doing.
Can you expand on that? They have a bad conscience?
That's what I mean. They know what they're doing, and they know that it's wrong.
But they're doing it for their own self-preservation?
Well, they have a variety of motives, but we should always suspect that one. The question is, are they doing it just for their own self-preservation? Yeah, you could say that. I mean, socially, people manipulate the economic system, deny human rights so that they have more profits.
Could you say, I've heard stories of people, of cases of people going for an abortion and it's been botched and the person has died.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often said, well, why didn't the family press charges? And the answer was, well, they were ashamed. Well, it's legal, so if they were ashamed, they knew it was wrong.
Right.
That would be an example.
Right. Yeah. So the question Eleanor just brought up is she knows of families, for instance, in which a woman has gone to have an abortion, the abortion was botched, and she died, but the family declined to press charges because they were ashamed. And the shame is one of the ways the natural law asserts itself.
Father, that's also what protects Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, protects Planned Parenthood. That's what Eileen said. So they know what they're doing. One of the things that we need to remember, again, taking the Catechism's point of view, which tries to take God's point of view, one of the things that we need to remember is that they are accountable to a divine judge. for the deeds of their lives. And then that includes mistaken ideas, culpable ignorance. They're accountable for that. And they're accountable for the things that follow from that. So, to use an example, movie makers, that includes sex scenes in their movies, are morally culpable for every sin that is committed because of those sex scenes. So it's not just that they sinned by creating this so-called art form, but they're responsible for all the sins that follow from it. So these image makers have a lot to answer for. Now, it's very easy to feel self-righteous and judgmental and condemnatory about this. But the last thing that we need to remember is that these people, as powerful as they seem now, they need our compassion and our prayers because of what they're going to answer for. So when we engage with these efforts to deny the natural law, we need to do so on the basis of compassion and prayer. But we do need to engage. We do need to engage. So there's much, much more to say about this, but that's as much as I want to present now. Brian, should we take any questions? There have been a couple so far.
Yeah, if anybody's got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Larry, what about issues, that's clear that if Hollywood is making a movie and they're incorporating something that, they shouldn't from a moral standpoint like that, that they could, I didn't realize that they could actually be held accountable for other people's actions because they based it upon that. I read recently there was a young man who broke into someone's home claiming to be a vampire and trying to suck her blood. Now, my question is, could the person who wrote that story be held accountable for that?
I suspect yes, ultimately. In the end, it's not up to us to make the judgment. So what is actually in that person's heart is known only to God. Whether the person believes in God or not, that's known only to God. But yeah, I personally find the focus in our society on Satanism and vampirism, I find that very disturbing. It's been quite some time, but do you remember, I think it was back in the 70s when The Exorcist came out, and then remember the Omen movies started? The sociologist's name is Peter Berger, and his theory, I've not been able to find this essay, but his theory, I remember reading it, so I know I saw it in print, but I can't find it. And that's before I started photocopying stuff like this. But his theory was that Satanism functions in our society in the same way that sex did in Victorian society. So, just as the Victorians were prudish, about sex, or that's their reputation anyway. So now we're kind of prudish about religion. And one of the ways that that prudishness comes out is in, you can't suppress something as powerful as religion, just like you can't really suppress sex. The way this comes out is in Satanism. So it's acceptable. It's acceptable to be a Satanist in our society.
Right, and that's what's prevalent in teen literature right now.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I had a young lady say she was so tired of reading about vampires, zombies,
Mm-hmm.
werewolves, all of that sort of paranormal stuff, that it was hard to find anything else, but that is prevalent everywhere in terms of there are so many different books available to teens on all the paranormal stuff.
Honestly, my take on all of this is go back to what St. Paul wrote to the Romans, chapter 1. This is the way the wrath of God manifests itself. So he's not hurling thunderbolts at us, but he's just letting us decline.
You mentioned that those who know those who deny natural law know what they are doing and they know it's wrong. That makes it seem fruitless to try and win them over with arguments based on logic or morality or anything else, because they're not interested in hearing the truth.
Especially if they're postmoderns.
They
don't
already
believe
know
in
the
argument.
truth. So how do you engage in a way that makes a difference if they know it's wrong and they're doing it anyway? The truth isn't going to set them free. At least the truth that I expressed to them isn't.
Well, an analogy one of my seminary profs used to use was, it's like water on a rock. It just keeps dripping, and eventually one drop will break through. So it may not be the drop that you represent, but if you're one of the 5 billion drops of water that finally breaks through, it's worth it. It's worth it. A lot depends on whether you're talking about individuals or groups also. If you're talking with an individual, what I look for is what they're uncertain about. What kinds of apprehensions they may have, or what kind of sense of incompleteness they have about their position. Nick?
I was going to respond to that in the sense that I think that's where being able to be present in both a loving and a truthful way simultaneously is so important.
Yeah, I agree. Nick just said that's where it's important to be present in a loving and truthful way. Is that what you said? I agree. Speaking the truth in love, that's what St. Paul said to the Ephesians.
And it isn't our responsibility for the outcome. That's up to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, ultimately, this is God's problem. Okay, ultimately. So, if he didn't want atheists in the world, he has a very simple solution at hand. But he still loves them, and that means we have to love them also.
Would you say atheists don't believe in natural law, or they do believe in natural law?
Some of them do. Some of them do. So I think he converted to Catholicism by the end of his life, but Mortimer Adler was an atheist for most of his life. And this is the man that put together the Great Book series, for instance. He was a very passionate Aristotelian Thomist, but he was an atheist until the very end of his life.
So, for atheists, where do they think they come from?
The question is, where do atheists think they come from? I think they don't think about it. So I just saw there's a new series on Discovery Channel called Curiosity, and the very first show, this was probably 3 weeks ago, was Stephen Hawking's. It was about Stephen Hawking's and his theory that the universe does not need a creator. So and what it came down to was the key to his argument is something that most people do not understand. I certainly don't, and that's quantum theory. But in quantum theory, apparently things can appear and disappear. And so if that's the case at the quantum level, his conclusion is that can be the case with the universe too. So it can just appear out of nothing.
But isn't that the same parallelism of God?
Well, he's using the argument to deny the need for a creator God. So his is the most thoroughgoing that I've been exposed to. But I don't read many atheists because I don't find it ennobling, and I feel sorry for the people ultimately.
Hawkins has moved progressively towards that position over the last 10 to 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
15 years ago, he wrote about it. He wrote about theism as a respectable alternative, and he seems to have discarded that.
Yeah, Nick is saying that Hawking's moved to this position gradually over the course of 10 or 15 years, but 10 or 15 years ago, he thought theism was respectable.
But if you think of his physical circumstances,
I know.
that man's got to be going through one horrendous spiritual conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, there's something more than poignant about the fact that in this television show, whenever you see him, he's in that wheelchair, almost completely paralyzed. And you hear the recording of the voice synthesizer that he uses. I don't know how long it actually takes him to synthesize even a word in real time. But yeah, Nick's point is he must be going through a terrible internal spiritual conflict. And that would be my guess. And that's pretty much what I think, what most believers believe about most atheists. They're in a terrible internal conflict. And it's one of the reasons why they react so strongly and so negatively to people that simply reassert the natural order, which includes the existence of God.